Hi. So today I'd like to talk to you about something which I think is one of the most important skills that you need to mix and master well. I don't know what the top 3 things are in my mind, but this is definitely one of them. And we're going to be talking about this today. It's loudness, but I don't mean loudness in the sense of how loud we master something for streaming or CD or something. I'm talking about listening levels. And in my view, my experience, it's definitely one of the top 3 most important things that you have to get right to mix and master well. Really, really vital that you get a certain skill set under your belt. So we're going to look at what these issues are. There are 3 things. We're going to break this down into 3 issues around listening levels that are vitally important to not just understand. I think the key here is building it into your workflow. That's the hard bit. Understanding it is the easy bit. So even if you're not a mixing and mastering engineer, or you're not learning to be one, but you're an artist or somebody from a record label or a producer, I think these skills are equally as important for you, and certainly equally important to understand these concepts, because they're going to affect you just like they affect everybody. And so it's really useful, I think, for you to understand how, when you're sent something from a mixing and mastering engineer, these different factors are going to affect how it sounds to you as well. So we're going to look at all of this. But before we do, if you find these videos useful, if you can subscribe and like the video and ring the bell, that's incredibly helpful to me and really appreciated. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Louder is better. Now, we've all heard this, we all know this, but let's look a bit more at this, because it's really important to get this right. So our brains automatically make things sound better when they're louder. You can't get away from that. You hear more detail, things sound richer, they sound more exciting, they sound bigger. All of that just is built into our brains. In my experience, it's the biggest problem that you need to get past is yourself, part of your self saying, oh, I know this is the case, but I can hear past that. I know this, but I can tell. That's, I think, the biggest danger that a mixing or mastering engineer faces is that little voice telling you that. That, in my experience, is a big mistake. Now, there might be somebody out there somewhere that can do that, but I haven't met them yet. But you have a tendency, I think, all of us have a tendency to think that we can. But if you take my advice, nobody can. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Now, when you turn something up just a tiny bit, like say half a dB, that's, I would say, roundabout, I don't have scientific evidence of this, but I would say my experience is that's round about the limit of what most people can tell about whether something's louder. It's around about the level of, you turn it up by half a dB, and some people won't notice it at all. Even if you explain that it's being turned up, they won't be able to tell. Some people will hear it right away. Some people will notice it if you mention it to them. It's that kind of level. But I also find that that's loud enough. That level, that small amount of increase, is also enough to make people think something sounds better. You just turn it up by half a dB and it sounds a little bit better without knowing quite, what's happened. And a dB louder is definitely loud enough to make things sound better. And it's an age-old trick that dishonest mixing engineers have employed, where an artist or client comes into the studio while they're mixing, and they're mixing away, and the artist just says, well, it's not quite, I feel like it wants more excitement, and it wants some more warmth, it wants, more depth, all those kind of descriptive words that could mean many things, but something about it just isn't quite ticking the boxes for them. So the sound engineer pretends to make a bunch of changes, and all they actually do is just turn up the volume a little bit, and then they press play. And wow, the artist or the producer or the record label boss says, hey, that's it, it's definitely, you've definitely got it. And it's a dishonest trick, and it's a trick that's also used, I hate to say it, but by many plug-in manufacturers. And I really wish they'd stop doing it. And none of the plugins on the screen here at the moment are actually that suffer from that, but a lot of them do it where they just, even when everything's at 0, they've turned it up by half a dB or a dB, and in their literature it says, oh, just putting things through this, even without adjusting any of the, even with everything at 0, makes it sound better. And I see experienced, well-known engineers making the same mistake. They think, wow, this just sounds better as soon as you turn it on. And actually, it's just a dB louder. So we can all make this mistake, and we all do make it. It's really, really important to be really aware of that. So when you're working, you've got to build this into your workflow. And this is the hard part. The easy part is understanding this. The hard part is making it part of your workflow so that you don't get caught out. Now, there are some changes we don't need to worry so much, and if we're under pressure, if you're a professional and you're working under time pressure, sometimes it's impossible to level match everything. The more you do it though, the faster you get at it, and there are some tools to help you do this. But if you're doing something like high passing something to get rid of unwanted low end, or maybe pulling out a resonance on something, maybe you don't need to level match. But as soon as you're doing something where you're working with just trying to enhance something, how it sits in the mix, adding things like saturation and enhancement EQ and other things like that, absolutely vital that you level match everything. The amount of times that I have spent ages tweaking and tailoring something, you think, this is sounding really great now, I've really got this, I've got that analog thing happening now, and because I'm A-Bing it, and it's like, wow, it's really got that extra depth there, that extra sound stage, and it's just really got that creamy richness and the details really coming out. And then I think, actually, have I really level matched this? I've been I thought I'd level match it, but is it really? And I A-B and A-B, is it actually really level match? And actually, maybe it's a bit louder. And so I turned it down a little bit so that it really is level match, and lo and behold, it's actually not any better. It's a little different, but it's not actually better. It doesn't have all that wonderful special sauce I thought I'd given it. And the amount of times that's happened to me, that's what happens if you don't level match, in my experience. So it's really vital that you, every time you do a step in your mixing, processing, that you level match things and A-B. Sometimes it's impossible, like particularly when, to get it exactly right, particularly when you're using something that compresses a dynamic range, like a compressor. Like, where do you level match? The lows are different now. The quieter things are different in relation to the louder things. So you can no longer level match accurately at that point if you're A-Bing it. But you just have to do the best you can. And the way I get around that, if I'm using a compressor and I'm trying to level match and I'm thinking, oh, I think this has improved it, but has it really? I think I've level matched, but I'm not sure if it's level matched because it's so different now in terms of its dynamic range. I turn it down a little bit lower. I level match it and then I turn it down a bit. And if it's still improving, even a little bit quieter, then I know I've got it. And if it's not any better, then I'll question a little bit whether or not it's actually improved it. But having said that, sometimes, the improvement is that bringing up of quieter things, and that's fine, that's what you're after. So I'm just saying, not to try to muddy the waters here too much, but there are times where it's not black and white how you level match things when it comes to kind of compressors and things, but just do your best. And with anything else, be ultra careful. You know, anything like EQing, saturation, particularly with saturation, really important that you level match. Saturation is, it's, you know, often a very subtle effect, and you can fool your ears very easily with just a half a dB difference on that one. So, and I also find that with saturation, you know, if you're adding it across a mix and you do it right, you can really bring magic out in the mix. If you do it wrong, you can really destroy a mix. So, ultra important that you do level matching. So, number 2 is listening levels. Now, as I said, the ears have a built-in EQ, so that as you turn the level up, your listening level of your monitors up, the lows and the highs move up in relation to the mids. It's like, if you look at the graphs on this, it's a bit like a low shelf that turns up progressively as you turn the level up, the listening level up, and a high shelf with a kind of bump on it that goes up as well. So that means that if you've got a certain listening level and then you turn it up, you've basically EQ'd it. Your ears have EQ'd it for you. So, I mean, that's a moving goalpost. Like, how can you mix with that? So, the way you can mix with that is by having a defined level at which you mix at. Really, really important. I cannot tell you how important this is. The amount of mixes that have been gone disastrously wrong because there's not been that, and you know, you mix at a really loud level and get the highs and lows just right in your mix, and then the next day or later in the day you turn the volume down, and now like the lows and highs just don't seem enough because your ears have EQ'd them right down. So of course you boost them up again, and then you give it to the client and it's like, whoa, this is over the top. Or vice versa, not enough because you've mixed quiet, and you know, then you've done a final run through really loud or something like that. It really, you know, it's impossible to judge those things if your ears are changing the goalposts every time you change the level. So being aware of that is key to mixing and mastering well, but getting into your workflow means making some changes in how you work. And there's 2 things that you've got to get into your workflow. It's built in, it's something you just always do. There's your 2-bus and there's your actual monitor level. And the 2 things have to both have a reference point which you always stick to. So it's not that, just to be clear here, it's not that you always stay at that level. You have a level that you generally mix at, but now and again you think, I'm going to listen to it quiet. Not for too long, for a little while, then you back up to your target level, and then you think, okay, now I'm going to listen to it loud for a bit. Not too long because it'll damage your ears. Back down again. So it's not that you don't try it louder and quieter for short periods, but you have a calibrated level that you always return to and spend most of your time mixing and mastering at. I mean, mastering engineers, this is 101. You don't even start mastering until you've got that level calibrated. But a lot of mixing engineers don't necessarily think about that. And it really, really is just as important. So how do we do this? Let's look at the 2-bus first. With the 2-bus, you've got your level. You don't want to hit into the red, obviously, you're going to be distorting. But you could be mixing and you could be like only halfway up the scale, and you could have like, 10, 20 dB headroom, so that, you've got loads of space there and you're mixing at that lower level. And even if you got your monitor set right, you're not going to be mixing at the right listening level. You're going to be suffering from the same problem. So you've got to make sure that your 2-bus is always hitting around about that, roughly that same level. So the way I do it is I have a limiter on my 2-bus, and I keep that limiter, it's right here on my screen, I keep this open all the time. And I have a level at which I allow it to hit when I'm mixing. Not too much, just the loudest peaks. And I know what that level is, and so I keep it there. And as I'm mixing and doing things, I keep an eye that it's not going too far into that or isn't hitting enough of it. Now there's some variation there depending on how dynamic the music is, but you get the idea. You can use that as a benchmark, as a calibration for how loud your 2-bus is. And that has to be calibrated, otherwise you've got this problem of never knowing what level you're actually at, and what your ears are doing with their own internal EQ. So you get that right, and then you've got to get your monitoring also calibrated. So that's pretty easy. Just put a limiter there. When you send it to the mastering engineer, turn your 2-bus down and take the limiter off. But just for mixing. And what I do is I put a gain plug in before that, or use the gain on the limiter to make sure that if I need to turn it down, I turn it down or turn it up. So once you've got that there, then you need your monitoring level. Now I have a controller here, and you could, it doesn't work with this particular controller, but with some controllers, you've got like a scale here that shows you how loud it's going to go, and you can put a mark on that scale for your calibrated level. And we'll look in a second about what I mean by what that calibrated level would be. My audio interface has on-screen control, and I can see exactly what levels it's at, so I use that. And I used to just use that and always adjust when I adjust this, I can see what level that is on screen. But now I'm using Cubase wherever possible to mix, rather than Pro Tools or Logic. I do use Pro Tools and Logic all the time, but whenever possible I move to Cubase because it has a lot of really great extra features that the others don't have. And one of those is that it has a control room built in which gives you different monitoring levels that you can choose between. So you can preset different levels, a quiet level, a loud level, or you can always return to a certain level. And it's got a lot of really great features, so I use that now. But it doesn't matter what you use, it's just as long as you have some way of knowing that your monitors are exactly at a certain level. Now what is that level? So it's a little bit variable. The general kind of thing that we aim at is around about sort of 83 dB SPL level, sound pressure level. Now you can check that with a sound meter, but there's a little caveat about sound meters. Unless you spend thousands on them, from what I've read, they're not going to be that accurate. But just to understand what that means, again, I'm not an expert on sound meters and the technology behind them, but I've read in a bunch of places a kind of agreement that they're not accurate in one way, but they are in another way. So this is what I mean. If I have a sound meter, and it could be on your phone, same thing. It's not going to be accurate, but it might say it's 83 dB, but actually it's 85 or 80 or whatever. So it's not accurate in that way, but they are accurate apparently in terms of they're always going to say the same. So it might be wrong that it's 83, but at that level, it's always going to say 83 every time. So you can know that it's consistent, even if the actual level might not necessarily be right. So the way I would just suggest one way around that is to have maybe 2 phones with an app on them and get a sound level meter for, don't spend too much on it, $50 or $60, pounds, euros, etc. And just look at them all and kind of roughly take a average between them about where you are. So I said 83 dB loudness on a meter in terms of the best listening level, but that does vary. Like, that depends on the size of the room, the distance you are from your speakers. So the important thing is not to go too loud. And to get the details on this, I suggest you go online and have a look, because there's lots of information about this. Really important that it's not too loud. If you're getting up, into the high 80s and beyond, you're going to damage your hearing. Over extended periods of listening at that level, you'll damage your hearing. There's a lot of research on that. So it's really important that you don't go too high. But as I say, it varies a bit depending on the size of your room and distance from monitors. So, it might not be 83, it might be, 78 or whatever. Find a level that's, is safe and that also is comfortable for you. Calibrate that with your monitors so you can always return to that level. And then you learn that. You learn that EQ curve on your ears by mixing and listening at that level, checking it on other systems, feedback from clients, a million other things that you'll do out in the world listening to your mixes to learn. Basically, you're learning that EQ curve. You're learning that, okay, that amount of bass at that level, that amount of high end, that's right. I can tell that's what I'm after. But that's something you can now return to as you're mixing and mastering, and be sure that you're going to get the results you want. And so many mistakes get made when you're not doing this, and then it's down quite a bit lower later in the day or the next day than it was, and you just got a completely different EQ curve you're listening through. And so you're going to change the level of highs and lows to make that sound right to you, and it's going to be completely wrong for a different listening level. So, really important to get that right. Now, again, just one final thing about that. Listeners are going to be playing at all different levels, and so it's going to change. So it's not that you're trying to deal with that. You can't. What you're trying to do is give yourself a base point, a benchmark, calibrate your ears to a level that that you've learned how things sound at that level of built-in EQ, because there's going to be a built-in EQ, but you learn that. You learn what is the right amount of bass and top end at that calibrated listening level, so that every time you get back to that, yeah, I'm hearing things in a way I understand how this is going to sound and how it's going to translate. And what you don't want to do is have that as a moving goalpost where you never quite know what you're really hearing and how much your ears have turned the bass and treble up and highs up, depending on where you've set your level. So that's number 2. Let's move on to number 3. The last one here is, if it isn't tough enough for us having our ears EQ things progressively as we turn them up and down, our brain also EQs things, but not in the same way. So the way that works, and again, that's built in, we can't hear past it or change it. It's what it is. So you have to learn to work with it. So with this one, what happens is, over extended periods of time of listening to the same thing, your brain starts to EQ, and it starts to dampen down the things which are maybe more prominent. And it's not an exact science. It's not like, with the ear EQing with level, there's an actual graph that you can track and see exactly what it is. With the brain, on extended listening, it's different depending on the music, and you can't, know exactly what it's going to do. But generally speaking, the way it works is, if you've got a certain amount of highs and you've been mixing that for a bunch of hours, your brain's going to start to turn those down for you. It gets used to them. It starts to EQ them down. And it's the same with the lows or any other frequency. If you've got a certain level of mids and you've been mixing for too long, those mids will start to become less. Your brain will EQ them, and you'll start to want to turn them up to hear them again, or highs or lows. Ultra important to deal with this. The amount of mixes that have been ruined because somebody has been at it for too long and their brain has EQ'd it and they hadn't realized that, and they've compensated for that EQ and they've got a disastrous result. Ultra important to get that right too. So This again, you know, it has its slightly, you know, tricky things. You know, if you're doing this professionally, you're under pressure. Sometimes it's not possible to take the breaks you'd like to take. But you also have to protect your reputation, so it's really important that you do something about this. So if you can actually take a break, what I would suggest is you mix for maybe 3 hours on one thing, maybe 4 hours. I don't know, there's no definite time limit there. But I would say, in my personal experience, once you've gotten up to 3 or 4 hours, it's definitely time for a break, and you're going to start to be, your brain's going to be starting to EQ stuff. I'm talking about listening to the same track. At that point, you know, move to another project if you can't actually take a break. You know, if maybe another track of the same artist that sounds really different, or even better, a different artist, a different album that sounds really, really different, even a different style. Refresh your ears at least for 2 or 3 hours before you come back to the first one. I don't personally find an hour's break, even completely break from listening, is enough. Might vary on the person, but I would say that's not long enough. So go off and work on something else for a good period of time before coming back, at which point your ears are probably fatigued anyway and it's time to take a break for the day, but we don't always have that luxury. But if you can actually take a break and come back the next day, that's a much more likely that you're going to be hearing it clearly again. So even if you have to jump to do another project, give yourself a good set of hours before coming back to the first one again. And the amount of times that I've done that and then I've listened back and like, wow, there's way too much top end, or, you know, there's nowhere near enough low end, or vice versa, or whatever, because my ears had EQ'd it because I'd been at it for too long. Really important that, you know, if you're starting out with this, it's a good chance that if you mix for too long and then you listen back the next day, you're just going to have to remix it. But if you're a bit more experienced, you know, hopefully you're just going to have to make some smaller adjustments, like, okay, I need to bring this down a bit or bring that up a bit. But it's really important that you get that right and that you schedule things. So just a little tip here for professional people doing this for a living is to schedule things so that you're not up against it with a client, so that you schedule things so that you don't do that mix or that master like right before you have to give it to them, because then you don't have that gap and you'll end up having to give it to them without being able to check it the next day. So if you schedule a bit better, then you'll basically give yourself a couple of days breathing room at the end of finishing the mix, even if it's a rough mix or a mastering session, and then you can come back to it and have a final listen and think, oh, okay, yeah, I need to do that final adjustment before giving it to the client. So those are the 3 big ones about listening level, and I've given you hopefully some useful tips on how to build it into your workflow. Absolutely, I cannot emphasize how essential this is to get this built in your workflow to get really great results. So I hope this was helpful. If it was, please do subscribe and ring the bell and like the video. That's really helpful to me and really appreciated. And hope to see you next time.